You specialize in capital punishment.
Yeah, capital punishment, crime. I do collect all over the gamut of everything, but basically for the book we focused on the crime capital punishment collection.
Right, but you bought all these. You have freak animals. You have other human remains.
Yeah.
But this is sort of your passion.
Yeah, this is my specialty is the capital
this
punishment.
field, and that's a very hard thing to collect. I remember that auction. I didn't get anything from it, but I remember it. I have the catalog. I looked through it.
I bought one lot out of that auction. I sold a third of my collection off to pursue one piece.
Nathan, they can't see you.
Should I be
You want to move the shark? You can see him. And he'll tell you what that is. That's an amazing piece.
That is an amazing thing.
He's probably insulted that we have something.
Right. So, where did this interest come from? Can you trace that back to anything?
Well, I've always been interested in just collecting in general. Like much like him, I was collecting, little skeletal remains of animals when I was a kid. But I've had a strong interest in history my entire life. I used to go out as a kid and I would metal detect and I would look for, Civil War artifacts and things like that. But while everybody else was interested in the historical aspects of like people that were nice and did things that were progressive for humanity, I was more interested in the people that were monsters and they did horrible things. And I was really drawn to things that were just more on the dark side of history, and whether that be criminals or tragedies, I was always interested in that aspect. And at one point, I used to watch crime shows quite frequently, and I found a guy that was a serial killer that was in my state. Now, I live in Maryland, and there's not a lot of serial killers in my area for some reason. It seems like they're mostly in the Midwest, but there was this guy, and I had never heard of him, and I decided, what the hell, I'll write him a letter. And I started corresponding with this guy. I ended up writing back and forth with him for 2 years, and it just ended up spurning a very expensive collection of crime.
Wow. And what was the first piece that you acquired in this area?
In crime, it was probably the stuff I was starting to get from this guy. His name was Haddon Clark. He was a serial killer in the Rockville, Maryland area. He used to be known as the Rockville Rocket. If you live in an area that kind of has like the local crazy homeless guy, he was the local crazy homeless guy in the area, but nobody knew he was a serial killer. He used to rollerblade all around the Rockville area wearing a Washington Capitals jersey, and that's why he was nicknamed the Rockville Rocket. But on the side, he was cross-dressing, he was murdering women and young girls, and he was a cannibal.
Wow.
And the reason I wrote to him was because in the documentary that I was watching on him, he had drawn these very bizarre pictures of little girls that were doing sign language, and knowing his criminal history.
Hold on a second. I think those are up there.
In one of these slides?
Yeah. I hope so. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Those are
Alright.
really
It's in the
odd.
book.
They're in the
there's
book,
one in the
yeah.
book.
Okay.
If you have the book, one's on the bottom right corner of page 189. But he was drawing these really bizarre pictures of children doing sign language. And the guy supposedly has multiple personality disorders. When I was writing to him, sometimes I was writing to him as Haddon, sometimes I was writing to him as a little girl. So it was just a very interesting person to write to. And he would just send me the most bizarre stuff. Like just out of the blue, didn't ask for it, he would send me a little envelope or a little plastic bag filled with his fingernail clippings. Or he would send me a necklace that he made out of the dental floss toothpicks. Sometimes he would send me his old dirty socks. Like, I didn't ask for any of this stuff, he was just sending this to me. I was writing to him more so on the fact that I was interested. It was a local case and I was interested in crime. But it started, I started building up a collection of this stuff, and I was already a collector, so it just spurred further interest.
And you collect from both sides. You collect from the criminal and from the law enforcement.
Yes, I'm very, very interested in capital punishment. I'm a book dealer by trade, and I was always looking for interesting pieces of historical memorabilia, and I found a long time ago an invitation to attend an execution. And a long time ago, and still to this day, in fact, if you were going to attend an execution, you were given usually a card that was filled out by the sheriff or who was officiating the execution, and it was an invite-only event. There were some executions that were held in public, but a lot of them were held behind prison walls, and they were attended by local people that were pillars of the community and people that were directly affected by the crime and newspapermen. But there's all over the record of capital punishment, there's these little pieces of ephemera that have been left behind. And when I found one, I originally bought it as a piece that I was going to sell for my business, but then I found another, and then another, and now I think at this point I have almost 40 of them.
Wow.
So, you know, it just kind of steamrolled from that point.
Yeah.
And you have the death orders, right? Like, those are interesting, yeah.
Yeah, what he's talking about, and she was mentioning this earlier, there's an auction, there's a gentleman in Canada named Billy Jameson, and he's one of the collectors that I really looked up to, but unfortunately on his 50th birthday he passed away. And in part of his collection he had the archives of an English hangman. So in the archives he had all of the orders for the hangman to attend all these different things. So basically he was written a letter by whatever prison was going to conduct an execution and said, hey, would you please show up at this place and, you know, we'll give you £50 for hanging this person. So I have the entire archive of his papers, and one of the more interesting pieces in that collection is I have some of the papers when he was assigned to hang some of the Nazi war criminals.
And that's Pierpoint, you know?
Yeah, that's Albert Pierpoint. I also have his father's stuff.
Yeah, that's nice. That's up there. You want to show that? That's the book with the hangman's tape measure?
So this is Henry Albert Pierpoint's logbook and tape measure. So this is the tape measure that he was measuring how tall a person was and how thick their neck was, because that would determine how long or how short he would make his rope so that would ensure an instantaneous death. They were ethical hangmen, so there were ways to officiate an execution which were not ethical, where you would literally strangle to death. But these were dead drops, basically. The second your platform dropped, you would snap your neck and you would have instantaneous death. So in his logbook, he would write down all their measurements, and then also write down notes on how they died, like if it was a quick and efficient execution, so that it can improve his process. Because these were professionals, even though they were killing people for a living, they did not want to make any of these people suffer. You know, you could look upon them as bad people, but they didn't want to endure any suffering towards these people that were, you know, anything that was not necessary. They didn't want to make them suffer any more than they had to. But there's lots of interesting stuff written throughout the book. One of the things that's written in the logbook is the case in England, which is fairly famous if you do research on it, where people were operating what was called a baby farming operation. And they basically started like what was an adoption agency. It wasn't proper for a woman to have a baby out of wedlock at the time. So people would have a baby, and then they would give them to these people that were supposed to be finding a wealthy family that could not conceive, and basically it was like an early form of adoption. But the people that had babies would have to pay these people to find a home for the infant. But what some people started to do was some people started to take the money for the baby and then drown the babies in the river and throw the cadavers in the river. So there was several of these incidences of baby farming in England, but this is one of the cases of baby farming, and they make note of the double female execution for the baby farming incident in the logbook.
Yeah. See, that's what I mean. Your collection is powerful. And because I'm older, I remember when that came up at Christie's.
Yep. I have the catalog for that, so I've traced back before I bid on any of this.
And I didn't bid on any of it because it's a little outside my field of expertise.
And that dramatic photograph? Shot by that photographer.
But even at the time, and that was a long time ago, I had just started really seriously collecting Memento Mori. That auction just struck me as one of the most fascinating and esoteric things I've ever seen. And also, that's when Christie's started selling weird stuff.
Well, what's funny about that auction is I have the auction catalog, so I traced I do a lot of research for anything I buy, and when I trace back the auction, I found out what this originally sold for. I think I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it sold for 40,000 pounds. And I paid nowhere near that.
Now that's fascinating. That is fascinating. All right, so let's start at the beginning of your chapter, and you can talk about what you want to talk about. That thing looming behind you.
This thing here?
Mm-hmm.
That's a Oddfellows scene bearer's robe. I have that kind of like sitting in the corner of the house. Some people, when they come to the house, mistake it for a Ku Klux Klan robe, which I always make sure, no, it's not. But basically, part of the initiation she was talking about earlier with the papier-mâché skeletons, they wear kind of like a hooded, it's supposed to look like an executioner's robe. They also do mock executions. So there's a company called Dumoulin, which makes like a guillotine. I have unfortunately not been able to find one, but you'll see these quite frequently. I have like 4 or 5 different variations. This is my favorite. It kind of has like a 19th century like oilcloth type fabric, and it's brown instead of the typical black that I find. I loved it.
You do fraternal things as well.
I do a little bit of everything. So I most of the fraternal stuff I have, I used to clean out Oddfellows lodges a lot. I had a friend that was the president of the Oddfellows Lodge of Maine, and every time they were closing down all these lodges, because membership has been way down in the Oddfellows, so their property is worth more than they can afford the taxes on. So they've been selling off all the properties. Me and Calvin would drive up to Maine and just load up the entire Oddfellows Lodge and drive it down, and we usually would sell everything out of the back of my truck before we got home, and I would keep the best pieces. So I have just like the cherry picked the best pieces out of all the lodges I could. So.
And there's some more fraternal things. What's that large piece on the right?
Large
The
piece
red.
That was a target for carnival. So I had 2 of these as a pair. It's like a monkey head. I collect circus, carnival, and sideshow stuff, in particular art. So I have a lot of like sideshow banners and stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have the space to display them, so they're just kind of like folded up. But you're supposed to like throw a baseball through its mouth. But I loved it.
It's good graphic.
Yeah.
Good graphic.
It's a pain in the butt to move.
Yeah.
We have to take it on like a teeny tiny little hand cart. We have to take turns pushing it down the street.
What's that thing made out of? What is it?
It's solid wood in the back, but
Oh, I
it's
thought it was cloth.
no,
There's
it's
cloth
cloth
in the
padding,
front.
but
Oh,
it's
God.
super duper heavy. And there were 2 of them. Our buddy Andy has the other one.
Yeah.
So both of them were on this tiny little hand cart. We had enough room to hold it with one hand and look over the top to see where we were going.
Weird.
And people were not getting out of our way.
This was at Brimfield, so
Yeah.
we were literally
Oh,
forcing
Brimfield.
people into the road.
Yeah, like,
Right on, then you're forcing him into.
and no matter how we said, excuse me and stuff like that, people like still wouldn't
Well,
get out of the
they
way.
don't
so.
care up at Brimfield. They're part of
Thankfully, Calvin's a goon, so he's
Yeah.
able to do stuff.
Now let's, can you tell us about that?
This here?
Yeah.
This was a pocket watch that was found on a murder victim, and the person that had been murdered was burned to try to conceal the body. But the pocket watch is gold, so someone that found it on the cadaver brought it in to try to sell it to a pawn shop, and this is in the 19th century. Somebody found this still pinned inside of the original pawn ticket when they were cleaning out whatever place this was found in, and it has the entire write-up of the murder that it was found with. The
Wow.
gold is kind of like melted and pulled into the back of the watch. I just thought it was fascinating.
See, so you collect documented objects as well.
Yeah.
If it wasn't documented,
Sometimes I'll buy things that are not documented, like I have a lot of stuff on display here, like prison shivs and stuff that are not documented where they came from necessarily, but I know they're real.
and that's a bit of noose up there, is that?
Yeah, that is a piece of noose that was used to hang a train robber. He was part of a gang, but he was the gang leader. His name was King, well, his nickname was King Pharaoh. And he was executed along with 2 other gentlemen because he robbed a train, and in the process of the robbery ended up murdering one of the attendants on the train. So one of the things with executions, after the hanging takes place, they used to sell lengths of rope to people that attended the execution because it was considered like a good luck charm or a souvenir. So a lot of times you'll find, like in these scrapbooks or what have you, pieces of rope that were used to hang someone. This was a particularly large one. Most of the time when I find them like this, but this one was like roughly like that long.
Wow. Yeah, this is stuff that you just don't see every day. You really got to be focused.
Yeah, it does not come up very frequently, so
Relentless.
thankfully since I'm a little bit more focused now, since I'm
Yeah.
running out of space in my house, when these things come up, I have the fiscal resources to pursue it.
Yeah, and that's an amazingly
So this is a
terrifying piece.
gallows hood. This was bought from the estate of a gentleman named David Hamilton. He was the official photographer for the U.S. government for the Japanese war crimes trials in Sagamo prison in Japan. So after World War II, all the people that were convicted of war crimes on the Japanese side were sent to Sagamo prison in Japan, including Tojo. And some of them at least, were hanged. So one of the souvenirs he brought back from Japan was one of the hoods that was worn by one of the war criminals that was
I had to
hanged.
fight to get that in. They didn't want it in. They thought it was really tasty. They thought it was going to cause some kind of
Too
controversy.
transgressive for me.
Yeah.
You figure they'd want controversy, man. It's
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah, the name Morbid is in the title.
Well, if it had any international implications, they
I
Yeah.
see
You
what
could be
you're
huge in
saying.
Japan right now.
And some
The top right is a wax model. I bought this. A guy was a physician in the United States, and he, at the end of World War II, went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he was treating people for radiation burns. And inside one of the bombed hospitals, he found these two melted wax models. So if you see the one on the top right, it's kind of like saggy and it looks really melty at the top. Both of these were part of the atomic blast. And the one on the far left on the bottom, you see a little label and it actually says Nagasaki on the label.
They had no problem with that to show how evil America was.
And this is a skull. There's a kind of, I'm sure you'll probably go into this later, but the story on the skull, I found out about this auction at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I live in Maryland. The auction was at noon in North Carolina, and my wife, who's standing over here, very graciously agreed to drive me to North Carolina with no sleep to bid on this auction in person, so I could buy this skull. But I really liked it because I like anything that has a little bit extra oomph to it, like to give it a little bit more context. And this had writing on it that said "Such is life," JWS. It had the birth date, and then the death date, and then the resurrection date. So
wow. Yeah.
English necessarily, but grave robbers used to be called resurrection men. So the people that basically got this skull wrote down and commemorated the day they dug it up.
You want to work into that. All right. Fascinating. Next up.